The entire situation began quietly, almost too quietly, in a neighborhood that prided itself on order, perfection, and strict compliance. The HOA called itself the Meadow Ridge Community Preservation Council, but everyone who lived there understood it was less about preservation and more about control. They enforced rules with the enthusiasm of a military unit, and any sign of individuality or non-compliance became an opportunity for them to exert dominance. Into this environment stepped the protagonist, a new homeowner who bought a modest property at the edge of the neighborhood, unaware of the chaos waiting beneath its polished surface. In the beginning, things seemed normal. Letters arrived reminding residents about lawn height, holiday decoration limits, and acceptable fence colors. But soon the protagonist realized this HOA did not merely enforce rules, they weaponized them. The first notice claimed the grass was an inch above regulation, even though it was trimmed the day before. The second accused them of leaving trash bins out too long, despite clear video showing the bins were dragged in within the time window. A third claimed improper placement of garden stones, complete with a fine that was nearly as much as a utility bill. At first, the protagonist tried to correct things politely, believing it was all a misunderstanding. But the HOA escalated instead of backing down. Fines doubled, letters arrived weekly, and neighbors whispered warnings about the board president, a woman notorious for petty grudges and obsessive power. It became clear this was not miscommunication, this was targeted. Someone on the board had decided the new homeowner did not belong, and now the entire system was being used to push them out. About liens, foreclosures, and legal consequences. Every week brought a new accusation, each one more absurd than the last, as if the board believed that pressure alone would force the protagonist to surrender. But something they didn't know was that the protagonist had a background that made them dangerous in a very different way. Years of experience in municipal planning, non-profit land development, and clever financial maneuvering allowed them to see flaws in systems most people never even noticed. The HOA saw a helpless homeowner. What they truly had was someone who knew how governments, public land transfers, and tax loopholes worked. And while the HOA continued its petty war, the protagonist quietly studied the community documents, financial reports, and meeting minutes, noticing details others overlooked. One discovery stood out: the HOA had been mismanaging funds for years, overcharging residents while underreporting expenses. Even worse, they were sitting on a large, community improvement account that was never used. That pool of money, collected from every household, was meant for neighborhood enhancements but had instead become the board's private stash for pet projects. Nothing illegal on the surface, but definitely vulnerable if examined under the right legal lens. The protagonist also learned something else: the land the neighborhood sat on wasn't entirely private. Several small sections, including walking paths, grass strips, and buffer zones, had been purchased with conditional municipal grants decades ago. That meant the HOA did not fully own certain plots, the town retained partial authority over them. Under specific circumstances, those lands could be reclassified, redirected, or even opened to public access. This was the moment a spark of an idea became a plan, an enormous, risky, brilliant plan. What if the HOA's own money, combined with their misuse of grant-dependent land, could be turned against them? What if the very neighborhood they controlled so aggressively could be turned into something they couldn't control at all? As the harassment intensified, the protagonist kept a calm exterior. Secretly, they met with city officials, environmental planners, and community outreach departments, presenting themselves not as a resident under attack but as a concerned citizen advocating for increased public green spaces. The HOA had unknowingly built years of documentation showcasing how unused their community enhancement funds were. The protagonist knew those funds could be redirected if framed as cooperative development. And since the HOA had legally committed to supporting the improvement of public adjacent land, they had unintentionally signed paperwork that made them financially responsible for a portion of renovations. Every fine the HOA issued, every harassing visit, every fabricated violation pushed the protagonist further, not into submission, but into preparation. The neighborhood board believed they were tightening a noose. In reality, they were supplying the materials for their own downfall. Meanwhile, the protagonist collected every letter, recorded every incident, and compiled a detailed file that illustrated a pattern of abuse of power. This documentation wasn't just for defense, it would soon become evidence used to justify a complete reclassification of several land zones around the neighborhood. The final straw came when the HOA placed a lien threat on the protagonist's home over a fabricated rule violation. That threat was the moment the protagonist realized the plan was no longer a hypothetical retaliation, it had to happen. And it had to be big enough that the HOA would never recover. By the time the HOA held their next meeting, the protagonist was already 10 steps ahead. City officials had reviewed the case and acknowledged the validity of the proposal. Grants were drafted. Park development teams were consulted. And the HOA, still oblivious, unknowingly approved a budget reallocation request that they thought was routine maintenance, but was actually the protagonist's gateway to legally converting portions of HOA-controlled land into public access green space. The move would reshape the neighborhood forever. What the HOA believed they controlled was about to become public property, funded by the HOA's own accounts. And none of them had any idea what was coming next. The days following the HOA's careless approval of the budget reallocation were strangely calm, almost unnervingly so. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, the protagonist received no letters, no threats, no surprise inspections. It was as if the HOA believed their escalating pressure had finally pushed the homeowner into silence. But the stillness was only on the surface. Beneath it, the protagonist's plan was unfolding with accelerating momentum, each step building toward a transformation none of the board members could have imagined. After the city's preliminary review, the proposal for public access green development entered a fast-track evaluation phase. The municipality had long sought opportunities to expand community parks, and the HOA's underused land, combined with the unused enhancement funds, presented a perfect opportunity. The protagonist attended meetings quietly, careful not to attract attention, providing documentation, grant references, and land use justifications that demonstrated how the HOA's own policies made the project legally compatible. The officials were impressed, not only by the thoroughness but also by how the proposal seemed to solve a long-standing challenge, transforming rigid private spaces into community-beneficial areas without the city having to pay the majority of the cost. Meanwhile, the HOA continued operating under the assumption that their neighborhood was firmly under their control. The board president, obsessed with order, remained unaware that several of the pathways, buffer zones, and communal lawns were no longer under their administrative protection. Their signatures, their meeting approvals, and their budget allocation had already given the city the leverage it needed. What the HOA believed was simple maintenance funding would soon be categorized as community contribution toward a public park infrastructure upgrade. And once the classification shifted, the HOA would have no authority to reverse. The protagonist spent evenings meticulously preparing the final components of the plan. They gathered every harassment letter, every fabricated violation, every piece of evidence showing years of selective enforcement. Not to use as revenge, but as justification for why portions of the neighborhood needed oversight from a governing body larger than the HOA. The documentation painted a clear picture of an organization that failed repeatedly to use its funds responsibly or act in the best interests of residents. To the city officials, this supported the argument that certain lands would be better managed under public stewardship rather than private control. When the city scheduled a joint hearing to finalize the transition of land classification, the protagonist knew the HOA board would be caught completely off guard. The board believed they were attending a routine meeting about minor financial clarifications. They did not expect the municipality to discuss opening large sections of their neighborhood to the public, nor did they realize they themselves had already signed the documents enabling it. In the days leading up to the hearing, strange behaviors began to emerge among the board members. The president increased community patrols, inspecting yards with heightened suspicion. More violation warnings were prepared, though none were delivered yet. It was as if she sensed something slipping out of her grasp but had no idea what it was. Neighbors whispered about unusual HOA spending, unexplained decisions, and a growing tension that made everyone uneasy. The protagonist remained silent, observing, waiting as the final pieces aligned. On the morning of the hearing, the meeting room filled quickly, city representatives, HOA board members, and a few residents who attended out of curiosity. The protagonist sat among them, calm and prepared, as the city opened the session by presenting the proposal. Maps were displayed, illustrating the land zones eligible for public development. Diagrams showed walking trails, green areas, and communal recreation spots. Next came the financial overview, which clearly stated that the HOA's community enhancement funds would cover a significant portion of the initial development phase. Confusion spread across the HOA board. They flipped through papers, whispered among themselves, and attempted to question the proposal. But the city officials pointed back to the HOA's own signatures, approvals, and written commitments, documents that the protagonist had strategically ensured were included in the project file. The board president grew visibly unsettled as she realized her own administrative habits had betrayed her. Every approval she signed without reading thoroughly had become another step in dismantling her control. The protagonist watched as the board scrambled to object, but the city representatives calmly countered with legal statutes, grant conditions, and HOA bylaws that left little room for refusal. The turning point came when the city noted the HOA's long history of unused enhancement funds and documented misuse of authority. The protagonist's organized file of evidence had been reviewed beforehand, and while it wasn't presented publicly, it had heavily influenced the city's stance. The officials framed the park transition not as an attack on the HOA but as a necessary improvement supported by the HOA's own actions. Once the board realized they were cornered, their objections grew desperate. But it was too late. The vote passed with overwhelming approval from the municipality. Several key areas of the neighborhood were now authorized for conversion into publicly accessible parkland. The protagonist had effectively removed the HOA's power from those zones entirely. In the days following the decision, chaos erupted within the neighborhood. The board president held emergency meetings, distributing panicked newsletters that attempted to reassure residents while blaming city overreach. But the documents attached to the transition had already been mailed to homeowners, many of whom were stunned to discover that the HOA's own signatures played a pivotal role. This revelation triggered quiet resentment among residents, who had long disliked the strictness but never dared to challenge the board. As the city moved forward with park planning, surveyors and environmental teams began arriving, marking boundaries and setting up development markers. Each bright flag in the ground symbolized another piece of the HOA's territory slipping away. Residents walked past the markers with curiosity and relief, while the board members watched helplessly, realizing the boundaries they once controlled had been redrawn forever. Meanwhile, the protagonist prepared for the next stage of the plan. Turning the neighborhood into a public park wasn't just about removing HOA control, it was about reshaping the entire environment into something that benefited everyone except the board that tried to ruin them. The protagonist knew the construction phase would bring even more upheaval, and they intended for every step to expose just how unnecessary, and ineffective, the HOA had always been. By the end of the second chapter of this unfolding drama, the board president found herself facing a reality she had never imagined. The HOA was losing power, not through rebellion, not through lawsuits, but through legal processes she had unknowingly supported. And as city officials scheduled the groundbreaking ceremony, the protagonist stood ready, knowing the most dramatic phase was still ahead. The neighborhood believed the storm had already hit. They were wrong. The morning sun spilled across Meadow Ridge, illuminating a neighborhood that had quietly, inexorably, begun to change. Where once the streets were rigidly controlled, where every blade of grass and every stone path had been scrutinized by the HOA, now flags, construction markers, and freshly installed signage hinted at a new reality. The city's plan to convert portions of the neighborhood into public parkland was in motion, and the board members, who had spent years enforcing petty rules and fines, were powerless to stop it. Survey crews moved methodically through the areas once dominated by the HOA. They measured plots, mapped trails, and photographed buffer zones. Every corner of the neighborhood that the board had claimed as private was now designated for public access. The protagonist moved through the streets with quiet satisfaction, observing how each step of the plan they had orchestrated came to life. It wasn't just revenge, it was a transformation, a reclamation of space for the greater good. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The HOA had funded the very changes that were now stripping away their authority. As construction crews prepared the land, the residents began to notice the difference. Children who had been confined to backyards now peeked curiously at the upcoming trails. Elderly neighbors, long frustrated by the strict rules limiting even minor communal gatherings, watched with quiet hope as grassy areas and flower beds were laid out for public enjoyment. The atmosphere was cautiously optimistic, tinged with disbelief. Some residents openly cheered, others whispered in shock about the sheer audacity of the plan. It was unprecedented. A neighborhood whose very board had sought to dominate every aspect of life was now becoming a place for everyone, funded by the resources they had controlled. The HOA board scrambled to regain control, but every attempt met resistance. Legal avenues were exhausted. The city cited signed documents, funding allocations, and long-standing misuse of HOA authority. The board president, once feared for her ability to manipulate bylaws and intimidate residents, now sat in meetings, powerless, watching her influence dissolve. Even her loyal supporters could no longer deny the logic and legality of the public park initiative. The neighborhood, once a fortress of rules, was opening, and there was nothing left to block it. With each passing day, the physical transformation became more apparent. Trees were planted along the pathways, benches appeared in shaded spots, and areas once dominated by carefully trimmed, monotonous lawns gave way to wildflowers and open green spaces. Paths meandered through areas that had previously been considered off-limits to residents. The protagonist oversaw these developments quietly, ensuring that every improvement adhered to the original plan, to create a public space funded by the HOA yet beyond its control. Every bright green lawn and each newly paved trail was a testament to strategic patience, planning, and the careful use of the HOA's own funds. News of the project began to attract attention outside the neighborhood. Local media reported on Meadow Ridge's transformation, emphasizing the twist of fate. The HOA, notorious for its strict enforcement and petty fines, had inadvertently financed a public park that was now accessible to the entire community. Interviews highlighted the irony, praising the protagonist's initiative and strategic thinking while noting the board's obliviousness. Residents took pride in their neighborhood's new identity, sharing photos of children playing on newly created trails and families gathering in spaces once off-limits. The protagonist's quiet, calculated efforts had now become a public story of empowerment, creativity, and poetic justice. Inside the boardroom, tension remained high. The president and remaining board members attempted to halt construction through last-minute appeals, but city representatives reminded them of the signed agreements, the reallocated funds, and the legal authority of municipal oversight. Even their allies among the neighborhood residents were reluctant to challenge the public benefits. The board had spent years trying to enforce control, yet now faced the bitter reality that control had shifted irrevocably. Every decision they had made, every signature and approval, had contributed to their own downfall. By the midpoint of the construction phase, the transformation was undeniable. Playgrounds emerged where meticulously regulated lawns had once stood. Walking trails wove through green corridors that had previously been private buffer zones. Small community gardens allowed residents to plant flowers and vegetables, a creative flourish the HOA had never permitted. The protagonist observed the progress without fanfare, satisfied that their plan had succeeded with minimal direct confrontation. It wasn't chaos, it was a reimagining of space that turned past oppression into community opportunity. As weeks passed, the neighborhood itself seemed to breathe differently. The rigid tension that had characterized life under the HOA relaxed. People gathered for informal picnics, jogged along trails that had once been marked private, and allowed their children the freedom to explore. The HOA's presence diminished, reduced to administrative forms and empty board meetings. Their power, once absolute, had been replaced by an open, cooperative community structure. The neighborhood had become a park in both the literal and symbolic sense, a place of growth, openness, and resilience. The final stages of the plan involved ensuring the HOA could never reclaim full authority. Legal notices were filed to solidify the city's jurisdiction over park areas, and community agreements were drafted to protect public access. Any future attempts to regain control would require overcoming multiple layers of legal and municipal oversight. The protagonist, having carefully navigated every bureaucratic obstacle, ensured that the transformation would be permanent. This wasn't merely revenge, it was the creation of something lasting, something that celebrated strategy, patience, and clever use of power. By the end of the project, Meadow Ridge was unrecognizable to anyone familiar with its former self. Where once there had been strict rules, fines, and intimidation, now there were open green spaces, trails, gardens, and playgrounds. The HOA's attempt to destroy a single homeowner had not only failed but had inadvertently financed a community transformation. Residents celebrated quietly but proudly, understanding the full story of how one person's strategic thinking had turned oppression into opportunity. And in the quiet moments, when the neighborhood slept under streetlights that now lined open pathways, the protagonist walked through the newly created trails. They observed children laughing, families gathered, and neighbors sharing moments of genuine connection. Every step reminded them of the journey from harassment to empowerment. The HOA's power had been dismantled without violence, without chaos, and yet with complete strategic precision. What had begun as a war against one homeowner had ended as a victory for the entire community. The transformation was complete, and the neighborhood would never be the same. The HOA's reign of control, once feared and unchallenged, had become a cautionary tale of hubris and oversight. Meadow Ridge was no longer just a collection of houses and rules, it was a living, breathing public space funded by the very organization that had sought to oppress. And all of it had been accomplished using their own money, guided by the foresight, patience, and meticulous planning of a single, determined homeowner. The story concludes with Meadow Ridge fully transformed into a public park, a permanent testament to strategy, resilience, and poetic justice.